We have lots of information that is packed in a short amount of time. We do have trainings that are more expansive on the dynamics, and so if that's something that you or your agency is looking forward to in the future, please contact us and we can see if we can make that happen for you. So as Wendy said, you do have access to the PowerPoint, and feel free to share that with your staff as well, and we'll go ahead and get started. So as Wendy said, my name is Laramie Gorbett, and I'm a human trafficking specialist here at TAASA. And we have the opportunity to travel across the state and share the knowledge that we've learned working directly with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, with members of the community, with direct service providers, and with law enforcement. So we use the knowledge that we've gained out there in the field to help you all who are still on the front lines do the best job possible and work in the most trauma-informed and victim-centered capacity possible. So please feel free to reach out to us if we have a training that meets your needs, and we're happy to help you with that in the future. So today we're going to talk about the definitions and statutes of sex and labor trafficking. We're going to talk about what that actually means and what that actually looks like in your community, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area. And we're going to talk about the vulnerabilities to violence and power control, and what the tactics that are being used by the traffickers, and how to identify those and the red flags. And we're going to talk just briefly about the effects of trauma and complex trauma that survivors feel, and how that can create barriers to receiving services, and how organizations can respond in a more trauma-informed manner. So feel free to type questions in the text box, and we'll try to get to them as we continue throughout the webinar. It's a little bit different format for those of you who may have seen me present in person, but we'll try to make this as interactive as possible and be mindful of the short time frame we have today. So more and more people are becoming familiar with human trafficking, and that's great. However, I think there are still quite a few stereotypes out there of what human trafficking is, or how it's something that just happens to other people in other areas, when in reality we know that it's something that happens all across the US and all across the world. And though it may look differently in rural and urban areas, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, it's something that all communities are vulnerable to. So when I talk about human trafficking, what am I actually talking about? Human trafficking is when somebody is profiting off the suffering of somebody else, when somebody is treating a human being like a commodity, like a good to be bought and sold. When that person's ability to say no to that exploitation matters less than somebody else's desire to profit. The official definition is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision of, or obtaining a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And you're going to hear those terms, force, fraud, and coercion, over and over today, and we're going to talk about what that actually looks like. So once again, force, fraud, and coercion. It's important for us to remember that somebody who's being trafficked is not acting on their own accord. They're not choosing to engage in that. There's going to be different forms of exploitation using those different mechanisms of force, fraud, and control. And we'll talk about how that looks, whether we're talking about adults or whether we're talking about children, and the dynamics that are in sex and labor. So it's important for us to know that the Texas law mirrors the federal law. And in the beginning of human trafficking investigations throughout Texas, a lot of law enforcement had the misconception that this is only a federal crime, and this is something that the FBI or Homeland Security has to investigate, which they often do, and they can be a resource for local law enforcement. But it's important to us to remember that we have a state statute as well. How many of you have heard of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act? The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was authorized in 2000, and it's been reauthorized several times since then, including as recently as 2015. In the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, it's really important for us to realize that this is a pathway, it can be a pathway to legal citizenship for immigrant survivors of trafficking. And it gives the authority to permit continued presence in the U.S. if after assessment it is determined that a person is a victim of a severe form of trafficking and a potential witness. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act is an incentive for somebody who has been trafficked to cooperate with law enforcement because, as I said, it's a pathway to legal citizenship, which is through a T visa. If somebody has been trafficked and in the U.S. and reports it to law enforcement and cooperates with law enforcement, they may be eligible for a T visa, which is similar to a U visa when somebody's been a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act also says that law enforcement shall protect the safety of the trafficking victim, including the protection of their family. So it's really important for us to realize that survivors of trafficking are survivors. They are victims. They are not criminals. And so it's really important for us to remember that. And just FYI, I'm going to use the different terminology, whether I say survivor or victim. We know that survivors are more than just the violence that has occurred to them. We know that they are empowered. However, when we use the term victim, it's often because we're talking about them coming in contact with law enforcement or prosecution. So they are coming in contact with the system because they have been a victim of the crime. So you don't have to be an immigration expert, but it's really important for you to know those immigration resources that are out there that can help a survivor with the T or U visa process. So why does trafficking happen? What are the root causes? When we talk about poverty, war, and natural disaster and a search for better life, that seems pretty broad. That helps us look at trafficking at a more macro level. We know that people who are in a desperate situation are vulnerable to violence. We know that somebody who's in a desperate situation, fleeing violence, fleeing poverty, fleeing war in their home country are vulnerable to exploitation from other people. We know that if somebody has the idea that women and children are less, then it's easier for them to have that mentality to exploit. We live in a culture where we want to have goods at a cheap price, and that demand for cheap labor can lead to things as in labor exploitation, things like sweatshop exploitation in the agricultural industry, exploitation in the construction industry. We'll talk more about that in a little while when we get to labor trafficking. High profit, low risk. What do I mean by that? We know that human trafficking is one of the fastest growing black market industries in the world. People make more money selling people than they do selling guns. If somebody gets pulled over and they have a van full of guns or drugs, that's evidence, and that evidence is easily seen by law enforcement, and somebody will be arrested. If somebody gets pulled over and has people that have been trafficked in the vehicle who are too afraid to speak or even make eye contact with law enforcement, more than likely nothing's going to happen. We're working on changing that with more interdiction training for law enforcement. But we know that there is lots of profit to be made in human trafficking, and there's low risk. We know that there are very few convictions for those that have trafficked people. We're working to change that as well. But we know that the trend is that lots of money can be made from selling people, and there's low risk out there. And so that's why more organized criminal organizations are getting involved. That's why we have more gangs that traditionally sold guns and drugs are now selling people because it's something they can make money at, and it's something where they're less likely to get caught. So we need to think about all of these root causes when we think about trafficking on a broader issue. How many of you know the difference between trafficking and smuggling? As we provide more information about human trafficking, I think it's really important for us to be able to distinguish between the two. I think it's important, especially for any of you that are involved in law enforcement, but at the greater public in general. There seems to be quite a bit of confusion. I had the opportunity to do training with Homeland Security, and when I did trainings with Homeland Security and across the border of Texas and Laredo, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, McAllen, I would ask them to raise their hand if they worked human trafficking cases. Nobody raised their hand, but I asked them to raise their hand if they worked smuggling, and they all raised their hand. And one of the problems of not being able to distinguish between trafficking and smuggling is that somebody has been smuggled. There's a high chance that they have been exploited as well, that they have been trafficked. And if we're treating somebody who is a victim of a crime like a criminal, that means justice isn't being served. And it means we're going to have even less of a chance to go after the person that is responsible for that crime. So some of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about trafficking versus smuggling. Smuggling is a crime against a border. It's when somebody crosses a border without proper documentation. It means that somebody is in an equal position of power with somebody providing a service. So let's say you have an immigrant that is in a desperate situation and wants to come into the U.S. And is desperate to cross. So they pay a smuggler a set amount. They pay them a fee that they've agreed upon, and then they provide a service. However, when somebody is in that vulnerable position, and somebody is already in a position where they can easily exploit somebody, that power dynamic shifts. And what was once an equal position has now shifted and can make somebody a lot more vulnerable. And the way that happens is somebody's in a desperate position to come into the U.S. They've provided somebody with a specific amount. That amount frequently changes. They say, oh, well, you know, you paid $10,000 for you and your kids to cross the border. Well, now that fee's gone up to $20,000. You don't have $20,000. Well, you do have a 12-year-old daughter. Or no problem, you can just work off the debt once you get to the U.S. and then that debt compounds. Or the situation isn't what they said it was going to be. Like instead of a restaurant, it's really a cantina. Or there's extreme violence that's used. So that's when we see the elements of force, fraud, and coercion. It's important for us to realize that trafficking is a crime against a person and a violation of their human rights. They didn't choose that situation. And once again, we're going to see the force, fraud, and coercion, and it's a crime that happens over and over again. So those are just some of the key differences between trafficking and smuggling. And it's important for us, especially for law enforcement who are investigating smuggling cases, to look further into those dynamics and see if there is indeed force, fraud, and coercion, if there has been violence, because then that trafficking situation has been compounded and it's no longer just a smuggling situation where there's been an equal position of power. So we know that human trafficking is frequently broken down into sex trafficking and labor trafficking. We have a tendency to focus more on sex trafficking, but it's important for us to realize that somebody can experience just as much trauma being trafficked for labor as they can be being trafficked for sex. It's also important for us to know that traffickers use violence and sexual violence as a way to have power and control over somebody. So those same dynamics can be used as in a labor trafficking situation. So when we talk about labor trafficking, it looks different depending on whether you're in an urban area or in a rural area. When we talk about more rural areas, that's where we see a lot of agricultural work, construction work, also domestic work. So things that on the outside look legal, like people working in the cotton fields, people working on a construction site, or people having in-home help, whether that's a nanny or a cleaning person or somebody working at a hotel. So things on the outside that look legal become illegal when we take away somebody's choice, when we take away somebody's choice to leave, and when we put people in circumstances where they're not being compensated for their work. So when we talk about more urban areas, we have sweatshops and factories. We have even when you see somebody on the side of the road with a sign asking for money, something that we see maybe every single day if you go to work and you pass lots of homeless people. Well, that can also be a situation where there's labor trafficking if somebody else is collecting that money, if there is force, fraud, or coercion. So it's important for us to be able to look below the surface to see if there are other dynamics involved. If you look on the other side of the screen, you'll see some different examples of sex trafficking. And we see things that are legal, like pornography and stripping. So things that are legal industries can be illegal and have dynamics of trafficking if there is force, fraud, or coercion. So even things like stripping, which is a legal industry if somebody is of age 18 or older, that can be a trafficking situation if somebody's forced to do it, or if they start out getting paid but then have to pay to work there, or if there's coercion involved. Let's say somebody is dancing there and then the owner says, well, now I'm going to need you to work these private events. Now I'm going to need you to go to the back of the room. And the person says, no, I don't want to do that. And then there's the coercion involved if they say, well, you know, I know you are working and trying to take care of your kids. What if I make a call to CPS? Or what if I tell your parents? So if there is some other element where that choice is taken away or they're not being paid for their services. Another really important dynamic for us to realize is that if somebody is under the age of 18, they cannot legally consent to sex. And so they cannot consent to somebody selling them for sex. So it's really important for us to realize that if we're talking about children involved in any kind of exploitation, that power and control dynamic is automatically shifted. We know that adults are in a position of power over children, and they're not in a position to be able to freely make those choices. So the elements of force, fraud, and coercion don't have to be proved when we talk about child sex trafficking, because they're already at an inherent power disadvantage. So that's why we have statutory rape charges. That's why we know that children can't legally consent to sex, so therefore they cannot consent to being sold for sex. So those are important dynamics that we'll talk about a little bit more in more detail when we get to that. Another term for that is commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC. It's the recruiting, enticing, harboring, transportation, providing, or obtaining acts that constitute trafficking of a minor for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And this can be, quote, through prostitution, but it's important for us not to use the term prostitution when we're talking about children, because once again, children cannot legally consent to sex. Therefore, they cannot legally consent to being sexually assaulted or somebody paying to sexually assault them. It's important for us to realize that the commercial sexual exploitation is more than just money. It's more than just cash. It's anything of value, whether that's drugs, whether that's higher status in a gang, or whether that is just a place to stay or food to eat. So it's important for us to realize that those dynamics are there. Another term is domestic minor sex trafficking, and that's a term we use when we talk about kids right here in the U.S., right here in your hometown. So once again, that's a commercial sex act, so that's anything of value. So here are those terms that we've used several times, and these are the terms that constitute the dynamics of trafficking: the force, the fraud, the coercion. I'm going to take just a tiny break so that I can maybe answer a couple of questions if we've had any come in. Oh, no questions? Okay. So when I talk about force, fraud, and coercion, in addition to the definition, I want us to actually think about what that means for the people that we're serving. When we talk about force, we're talking about violence. We're talking about making somebody do something, holding them against their will. And this is when we see extreme violence that we also see in domestic violence situations or in sexual assault. The beating, the torture. Many of you advocates out there have worked with people suffering from addiction. We know that an easy way to control somebody is to get them addicted to drugs. And then how do you control that person? You control what they're addicted to. We also know that that's an easy way to discredit somebody, because we know that traffickers know that we frequently dismiss people saying, oh, well, they're an alcoholic or they're a drug addict. You can't believe anything that they say. So that's a really good way to control somebody's addiction. It's also a good way to discredit them. And that is a tactic that traffickers and abusers use over and over again. You'll also see their branding or tattooing. In longer trainings, I go into a little bit more detail, but we know that branding or tattooing is a way of a trafficker showing that person as a commodity, as being their property. So whether that is a barcode, whether that is the pimp or the trafficker's name, or something that's linked to a gang tattoo, if it's part of a gang trafficking situation. So that can be an indicator. In addition to the force, in addition to the extreme violence and sexual assault, traffickers also often use fraud, which is the intentional misrepresentation of fact. So this is when they get tricked into a situation. It's something that they didn't agree to. It's not the conditions that they signed up for. So whether we're talking about a job, that the wages weren't what they were promised, whether we're talking about living conditions, whether we're talking about a relationship. And so this is when we see the dynamics of abusive relationships overlap frequently with trafficking, is that they think that the abuser is going to protect them, that the abuser is going to provide them with the opportunity for a better life. And this is especially true for young people and for survivors that have been in other abusive relationships. They think that this person is going to be the one who's going to make everything better. It's going to be the person that they're going to love them, protect them, and keep them safe, when we know that abusers and traffickers use that as a way to hook them and a way to get them in. Also, the fraud could be whether it's meeting somebody online, whether it's a young person who thinks that they're talking to another 14 or 15-year-old boy or girl, but really it's a 42-year-old man. But that's the fraud, is the intentional misrepresentation of material fact. And then we talk about coercion. This is also when we see a lot of similarities to domestic violence relationship. These are the threats. This is the intimidation. This is the emotional abuse, the control, the brainwashing. And when we think about threats and we think about people's biggest fear, if you think about somebody who's in an abusive relationship and has children, their biggest fear is that somebody's going to take those children away. And that is a threat that traffickers and abusers use over and over again. Also, if you're living in a climate of anti-immigrant sentiment, if somebody is an immigrant or an undocumented immigrant, and they see what's happening every single day to children and families and being separated, that's many people's worst fear. So abusers use that over and over, so that the deportation threats, the confiscation of documents, holding on to their IDs or their passports, that's one form of coercion. And we see that over and over again. Somebody asked, what is seasoning? And seasoning is a term that they use to explain physical violence, where they're pretty much, and it's a disturbing image and it's a disturbing tactic, but it's basically where somebody beats somebody into submission. They employ violence over and over again. They beat them, they rape them, so that it pretty much breaks their will, and they know not to fight back. They know not to run away. It's where they have pretty much taken away their will to fight through the violence that they've experienced. So let's talk a little bit about statistics. We know that human trafficking is something that's becoming more prevalent, but it's important for us to realize just how prevalent it is here in the United States and also here in Texas. We know that 1 in 3 runaway children are, quote, lured into prostitution. And once again, it's in quotes because there are no children prostitutes. There are children that are being sexually assaulted and children that people are paying to sexually assault. We know that they are approached by traffickers within 48 hours. So think about all the at-risk children and youth that are out there in this system. These kids, if they run away, 1 in 3 of them will be approached by a trafficker within 2 days. And the average age of entry into, quote, prostitution, 12 to 14 years old. So take a minute to think about that. Even if you're working with an adult who says that they are choosing to engage in sex work at 25 or 30 years old, whether or not they're choosing to engage in sex work at that point in time in their life, more than likely they've been trafficked since they were a child. So it's important for us to understand those dynamics. In America, victims of pimp-controlled sex trafficking are commonly forced to meet quotas of $500 to $1,000 a night. So think about the amount of money that that trafficker is making off of that child or that adult. And let's say they have 5 people that they're trafficking. That is $5,000 a night. So now they have every reason to keep that child or that adult from running away, from them, keep them from going back home or making an outcry, because all of those dynamics of abuse and control are there, and there's a lot of money to be made. 70% of victims of human trafficking have experienced sexual abuse or physical abuse in their homes. Why is that important? I think it's really important for us to realize the vulnerability to trafficking, and one of the huge vulnerabilities is already experiencing abuse. And for those of you who work with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, you understand poly-victimization. You understand that if somebody starts out their life confusing power, love, and sex and violence, and if rape is normalized and abuse is normalized at a very early age, this is just what they consider to be normal. It's considered to be, this is how you show somebody you love them. This is part of our relationship. And we know that if children are running away, they're either running from something like violence in their home, like sexual abuse in their home, or they're running to something, whether that's somebody meeting their basic needs by providing shelter, resources, food, clothing, or somebody saying, all that pain, everything that you've experienced in the past, I'm going to make all of that better. And so that is something that not only young people are looking for, but also adults who've experienced abuse. They're looking for somebody to help take that pain away. So somebody asked where these statistics from. I have the links towards the end of the PowerPoint, but most of these statistics come from the National Human Trafficking Hotline or through the Polaris Project. You can follow the link at the end of the PowerPoint where you can see these national statistics. They're a great resource. So once again, Polaris Project, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And also, when we start looking at trafficking statistics in Texas, this infographic came from the University of Texas School of Social Work and the Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. They recently conducted this study that actually gave us the numbers. So those of you on the front line, we were seeing trafficking, and we knew that there were numbers of victims, of survivors of trafficking that weren't being counted, and we didn't have the data to prove it. This study, it's actually 110 pages, I have read all of it. This study gave us the numbers. And you can see at the top there that from this study of IDVSA and the School of Social Work, they figured out that approximately 79,000 minors and youth are victims of sex trafficking in Texas, and approximately 234,000 victims are victims of labor trafficking. So remember when I talked about the importance of not underestimating labor trafficking, you can see those numbers, why it's really important for us not to underestimate the amount of labor trafficking that's happening in Texas. And that number comes to 313,000 victims of human trafficking in Texas. That number is huge. And from that, traffickers exploit approximately $600 million from victims of labor trafficking right here in the state of Texas. And when we talk about those 79,000 minors and youth that are being trafficked, as a result of that trafficking, it costs the state of Texas approximately $6.6 billion. And so that money is being spent whether we're identifying these young people as victims of trafficking or not. And so this study really delved into the system using data from the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Family and Protective Services. And so all those kids that are going in and out of, quote, the system, whether that was foster care, whether those are costs were associated with CPS and caseworkers or health care, or even the juvenile justice system. That's where that money is going, whether these kids are being identified or not. And if any of you are interested in this study, I can email them to you. If you want to contact me, my email is at the end of the PowerPoint as well. And I can email you the PDF of the 110 pages that specifically talk about how they came up with those numbers and the data behind it. But I think it's important for us to realize just the magnitude of the number of people that are being trafficked, but also what it's costing the victims, but also what it's costing the state of Texas as far as taxpayers' money and services. Texas is working to be more proactive with the work that the governor's office is doing, as well as the Office of Attorney General Human Trafficking team, of being more proactive in preventing human trafficking. But right now, still most of the efforts are reactionary, and that's where those costs are going into the system, whether or not those young people are being identified or not. So this is another graphic that talks about the vulnerability of trafficking, whether we're talking about sex trafficking or whether we're talking about labor trafficking. And these are some of the dynamics that we spoke about. And then there are some that you may not necessarily think about as being a vulnerability. We know that poverty, we know that desperation to improve one's circumstances, whether we're talking about international survivors or we're talking about domestic, whether we're talking about adults or whether we're talking about children. We know that not having equal access to resources, whether that's because of lack of legal status or whether that's language barriers, we know that that can be a vulnerability. But things that people often consider a strength, whether that's somebody's religious or cultural view. For a lot of people who are more religious, they consider that to be a strength or a healthy coping skill, but it's something that actually can be used and manipulated by a trafficker, by an abuser. And that is when somebody uses somebody's religious or cultural belief against them as a way to further have control. An example of this may be something that those of you working with domestic violence survivors have heard before, is when they are told that they are being punished, that the violence or sexual abuse that they're experiencing is because God has given them the authority to punish them for not following certain rules. And that is a mentality that that abusers and traffickers use, that they think that they have authority. Or even a cultural belief, let's say respecting elders. For many people, that would be a healthy belief that you want to respect the elders in your community. However, that can be used against somebody, especially a young person or a child, if respecting elders goes so far as never go against what an older person has done, or never tell family business, including sexual abuse or including trafficking. So even things that we often consider to be a strength for an individual are things that can be manipulated by an abuser or by a trafficker, including the relationship, the feeling of love and duty, or even ownership in a family. So it's really important when we think about dynamics of child abuse. Lots of times children don't want the relationship with the abusive parent or loved one to end. They just want the abuse to stop. And we also know that all those reasons why kids don't tell when they're being abused are the same reasons why they're not going to tell if they're being exploited commercially. This, if you love me, you won't tell. If you love me, you won't leave. Or this is how I show you my love. And so that relationship can be part of that exploitation. That relationship can be manipulated into something that is harmful for that survivor. So just an idea of how prevalent labor trafficking is. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are over 14 million people that are labor trafficked, whether that is in agricultural, construction, domestic work, hotels, 14 million people. So that's really important for us to realize just how widespread it is. The U.S. Department of Labor has identified 136 goods from countries that are using forced labor, and these are goods that we purchase every day, whether we're talking about clothing, whether we're talking about electronics, chocolate, palm oil. I mean, these are just things that we all consume, but we're not necessarily thinking of where they're coming from or how they're resourced. So it's really important for us just to kind of look past, what's on the surface to something that's happening, far more widespread than when we ever thought. Also, something for us to think about, the Urban Institute did a 2014 study of 122 trafficking cases, labor trafficking cases, and that 71% of the labor trafficking victims were actually here in the U.S. on lawful visas, and that these victims paid an average of over $6,000 in recruitment fees. So what happens where these people were had lawful visas, they were in the U.S. lawfully, and they were being tricked into paying these recruitment fees for jobs here in the U.S., and then they were still being taken advantage of. Somebody asked to explain more about the abuse of the spiritual belief. And I'm gonna get to that a little bit more when we go back to the dynamics. So I'm gonna come back to that question. So in a study from San Diego State University, 31% of undocumented Spanish-speaking migrant workers had experienced labor trafficking in San Diego County. So it's just, these statistics are a way for us to realize the prevalence. And once again, this is from Polaris Project, and you can click on that link and you can find out more statistics on labor trafficking. I'm not going to have time to go into all of these dynamics of trafficking people with disabilities, but realize that having a disability, whether we're talking about an intellectual, mental, or physical disability, leads to more vulnerability to exploitation. So some labor trafficking indicators: living in poor conditions, multiple people cramped in small spaces, living with employers, inability to be able to speak to an individual alone, or somebody always wanting to speak for them. It's important for us not to ask if a client or an individual has documents or proper documentation. You can ask if somebody has their documents, because that's going to indicate who's in that position of power. If there are signs of physical abuse, if somebody is not being paid minimum wage, that's a really good indicator of labor trafficking. So it's important, depending on where you are, to know the minimum wage for your state. How can you get some more information? Asking, can you leave your job if you want to? Not can you leave your job and are you going to be able to pay your bills if you quit, but can you physically leave your job, or has somebody threatened you and said, hey, if you leave, this is what's going to happen to you? Can you come and go as you please? Have you been hurt? Have you been threatened? Has your family been threatened? Where do you sleep and eat? Are you in debt to your employer? Not do you have them, but who has your identification? And here are some labor trafficking cases that have been in the news recently. If you want to click on that link, you can find more details about them. But know that for those that have been labor trafficked, in addition to criminal sanctions, there are also civil sanctions and civil remedies that are available to not only victims of sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. So it's important for us to know that there are those legal resources available that are there through civil suits, and there are more resources out there. So as I mentioned, we frequently see intersections of domestic violence and sexual assault in trafficking cases. We know that those dynamics frequently overlap, and one way they overlap is that traffickers use sexual violence as a tool, whether we're talking about sex trafficking specifically or labor trafficking. Traffickers and predators of sexual assault and domestic violence frequently prey upon marginalized populations, including immigrants, ethnic and racial minorities, people experiencing homelessness or poverty, LGBTQ+, and people with disabilities. So we know that some of the things that make somebody more vulnerable to violence or exploitation also creates barriers to them receiving services. So we need to think about the vulnerabilities, but also, is your organization working to go above and beyond in making sure that these different groups of people have access to the services that you provide, or have access to the criminal justice system? So many of you working in the anti-violence field have seen similar power and control wheels. This one has been specifically designed to illustrate the power and control dynamics of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And you can see that these are the same tactics that abusers use: the intimidation, the emotional abuse, the isolation, using privilege. And so this goes back to our question about using spirituality or somebody's religious beliefs against them. And that's using some people's I guess, interpretation of some religious text, as in, men are supposed to be the head of the household. Women and children should be seen and not heard. Or you don't go against the family. Or this is what God wants. Or God wanted me to punish you. So using that privilege, using that interpretation of somebody's, religious beliefs or religious texts, but it's ultimately putting that abuser in power, in control. And if they know that somebody has deep spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs or even cultural beliefs, they're going to use that to exploit them. Whether as this is God's will, this is, or this is what, this is my job to teach you. So using the idea that they are supposed to be in power and control, and that the violence that the individual has experienced is a tool for that exploitation or for that control. But once again, this is just another illustration of the different ways that a trafficker or an abuser can use all of these different dynamics to gain power and control over the victim or over the survivor. So talking about some of these vulnerabilities in a little bit more detail, we know that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or queer individuals are more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable because they're more likely to be homeless as youth. They're more likely to be kicked out of their family, kicked out of their homes because of how they identify or who they love or who they, are as individuals. We know that they are more likely to experience sexual violence in their heterosexual peers. We know that they're more likely to engage in survival sex, whether that's for food, shelter, drugs, toiletries. We also know that they are less likely to be able to receive services. So think about it. Is your only shelter in your area a faith-based community that does not reach out to the LGBTQ plus community? Does access to resources in your community come with adopting of a certain faith or a certain mentality? Think about your shelters. Are they trans inclusive? Where do men and boys stay if they are in an emergency situation? So think about all of those dynamics when you think about the services that you're offering. Are they available to people from all different backgrounds? And if they're not, how do you change that to make them more accessible to those that are most vulnerable? And as we mentioned before, if somebody comes from an unstable home life where they've experienced violence and sexual abuse, we know they're more likely to be exploited by a trafficker. Desperately seeking love or acceptance. Overly shares personal information on social media. So when we're talking about children or we're talking about vulnerable adults who put everything out there on social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, it's providing a textbook. It's providing a step-by-step how to exploit somebody. It's providing an instruction manual for traffickers, because every single thing that young person or adult is into, whether the music they like, if they had a fight with their family or their boyfriend, or they are broken, they're needing money, everything that goes on social media is providing a step-by-step instruction manual for traffickers. So it's really important for us to realize that. So some more red flags. If somebody is demonstrating mental health concerns like anxiety, self-destructive behavior or depression, other maladaptive coping skills, including substance abuse, drug abuse, suffers from untreated medical concerns, especially related to sexual or reproductive health. They have signs of physical or sexual abuse, neglect, malnourishment, poor hygiene. If they have any kind of a debt that they cannot pay off. If they aren't allowed to keep the money that they're making, who has that money? Is it their abusive partner? Is it the person they're working for? If they're frequently moving or traveling to new cities with people they just met. These are all some indicators or red flags that they may be exploited. Other victim indicators, expensive gifts, especially cell phones. You know, if you're working with a foster kid and they have an $800 cell phone, where did they get it? Where did it come from? How did they get the money to get that cell phone? These are just a few other victim indicators. So who is it that's trafficking these young people and other vulnerable adults? Who are the traffickers? You know, we have stereotypes of what a trafficker is, you know, a pimp with a flashy outfit and gold chains and a Cadillac with big rims. And yes, you know, that does exist, but it's important for us to realize that traffickers come in all shapes and sizes. You know, whether it's the overt pimp on the street or somebody that from the outside looks like a pillar of the community. What we do know is that traffickers are all masters of the art of seduction. They can look at somebody and see their vulnerability right away and know how to exploit that, whether that is a young person or whether that is a vulnerable adult. We know that once the trafficker has seduced that person, they use torture tactics to control them. They beat them down into submission. We know that they use different physical and emotional manipulation tactics to break down their entire sense of self and who they are and completely destroy their self-worth. Those of you working with domestic violence survivors, you see this over and over again. And these are the same tactics that traffickers use. Traffickers use increased anti-immigrant sentiment to maintain control of their victims. I mean, we see what happens to people every day, being separated from their children, separated from their families. Traffickers will use that as a tool. So what kind of traffickers are they? And excuse me for going through this quickly, but I am trying to be mindful of time, but just know that I do have information that goes into more detail on the different kinds of traffickers. But when we talk about the CEO pimp, this person's all about the money. And these are the people that hang out at the malls, that have the fake business card, or maybe they are trolling on Facebook or social media and say, oh, wow, I saw those pictures of you. You're so pretty. Have you ever thought about being a model? Or, I'm connected to the music industry here in Austin. Have you ever thought about being a singer or a rapper? So it's all about the money. It's all about the facade of a legitimate business. So whether that's music, whether that is modeling, whether that is even a dance school. So it's all about how to manipulate them through their desire to access money or access a profession. The Romeo pimp, it's all about the love. It's you're doing this for me. We're doing this so that we can have a better life. If you love me, you'll do this. And so it's very much manipulating the idea that if you love me, you'll submit to this violence. If you love me, you'll do these things that you never thought you would do. So it's also going after the person whose idea of love and sex and violence has been mixed up from the very beginning. The gorilla pimp is extreme violence. This is where we see the beating, the raping, the branding, the seasoning. It's where they are literally in fear for their lives because they've seen not only what has happened to them, but as what's happened to other people who dared to go against the trafficker, who dared to leave. And this is just extreme violence that most people can't even imagine. And then the familial trafficker. These are people that we less commonly think about as somebody who would be a trafficker or an abuser. These are parents, these are grandparents, these are extended family. These are the people who on the outside, everything looks good. They may be people who are well connected to the community. They may be the people that, work at the church or in the school, or the soccer coach, who on the outside everything looks good, but on the inside is the culture of violence, hopelessness, and trauma. A lot of times it looks like they lead a double life. So even on the outside, if everything looks great, they still have connections to criminal networks. They still have connections to people who are willing to pay to sexually assault their children. We know that they use all forms of violence, and that the physical and sexual abuse start at birth, that rape is normalized. We also know that these people on the out try to make everything look normal on the outside. They will be the ones who accompany them to medical visits, to parent-teacher meetings, or they're ones that are also going to work so that their children don't form any kind of relationship with anybody on the outside, whether that's other children or whether that's teachers or community members, because they don't want anybody getting too close or to ask too many questions. Somebody asked, which type do we see the most, referring to the different kind of pimps. And I would say that that pimps will use different tactics depending on who they're working to exploit. But familial trafficking is very common, as well as, the Romeo pimp. That often it's the relationship to the trafficker. And so that's where we see, a person, they don't see them as the pimp or the trafficker. They see that's the boyfriend, that's the daddy, that's the girlfriend, that's the person who's supposed to love and protect them. And so that's where we see those dynamics most commonly. And we also know that even the Romeo pimp will resort to violence. We know that the familial trafficker will resort to violence. So yes, you can find out by following some of the links at the end of the PowerPoint, you can find out more specifically about the different kinds of traffickers. We know that when people experience trauma, they try to hide or heal from that trauma in different ways. So, they will do it in a maladaptive way, which is, overeating, eating disorder, self-injury, engaging in risky behavior, going to drugs and alcohol, anything to numb the pain. So we know that if somebody's experienced trauma, they're more likely to engage in these risky behaviors. We know that when somebody experiences trauma, that their body is different, that their brain is different, and that they develop differently because of the deregulation of stress hormones and their body's response. In other trainings that I do, I go into more details on the neurobiology of trauma and what that actually looks like. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can contact us and we can see if we can work that out. But across the board, we know that when somebody's hurting, they're going to try to deal with that hurt in the way they know how. And for many young people and people that have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking, they try to numb that pain through alcohol, through drugs, through self-injurious behavior. We know that the system in general is traumatic, whether we're talking about the criminal justice system, whether we're talking about the child welfare system. We know that going to court or going to the hospitals for a sexual assault forensic exam, all of those things are traumatic, and that they can trigger survivors who've experienced abuse. So it's important for us to be aware of what potential triggers could be. We know that being trauma informed is to understand that when somebody's using these maladaptive coping skills, that it's not a symptom of mental illness or a behavioral defect. It's the way that they are trying to survive. It's the way that they're trying to deal with the pain and with the trauma. And being trauma informed is to understand the potential pathways for recovery. So there's a lot of information out there on how organizations can be more trauma informed. I was speaking with a trafficking survivor, and she says, yeah, it's real great to be trauma informed, but if you're not doing anything with that information, it really doesn't help anybody. So we have to move past being trauma informed to the point where we're trauma responsive. We're actually doing something with that knowledge. So we realize the impact of trauma and we understand potential pathways for recovery. We recognize the signs of symptoms of trauma not only in our clients, but also in their families and ourselves. We respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into the way we do things. We have to change the way we do things, whether it's the way we take hotline calls, whether it's the way we do shelter intakes, whether it's the way that law enforcement interviews trafficking survivors. We have to change the way that we do things and take our knowledge of trauma and work to resist re-traumatization. We know that that adults and kids and survivors are amazingly resilient. We know that people have who have support systems and things that give them hope and inspire resiliency. We know that they're there. And as an advocate, our job is to help find out what it is that inspires that resiliency and hope in that individual. And not only in the individuals that we work with, but also ourselves. We have to find that resilience in ourselves and the protective factors, not only in the people we work with, but also ourselves if we're going to continue to do this work. So we're running out of time, but some of the things that I would like for you to think about as you think about the work that you do with trafficking survivors, is the work that you're doing, are you survivor-centered? Do you have standard operating procedures in regards to reporting child abuse and to reporting trafficking? Do you have set rescue and response protocols? We have more and more communities that are organizing around human trafficking and putting together human trafficking coalitions and task forces, which is great. But are your response protocols trauma informed? Do they make sense? Do they have everybody coming to the table that should be at the table when we're responding to issues as complex as trafficking? Do you know who can provide you support? Do you know who to go to when you don't have the answers on how to handle these complex and difficult situations? We know that it takes everybody to fight human trafficking and that we can't do it alone, and we need to know who our allies are. Before I get to the scenario, and I know that many of you may be logging off soon as our hour is almost up, but a few more questions. Somebody asked, what about if there is no pimp and a young person, let's see, a young person is in the life? Okay, so that's a good question. So as I said earlier, a child cannot choose to engage in sexual activity. They cannot choose to engage in sex work. So if a child is involved in any kind of commercial sexual exploitation, whether or not they're being forced into it or not, that's still trafficking because they don't have the capacity to make that decision for themselves. So if a 15-year-old is engaging in survival sex, you have to think about who is benefiting from that vulnerability. So whether that is the person that's allowing them to stay with them or providing them food in exchange for sex, that person is still involved in the trafficking. So a young person doesn't actually have to have a trafficker, but that dynamic of power and control. So the person who's offering the resource, whether that's food, money, a place to stay, that person who's benefiting from that exploitation is benefiting from that vulnerability. That person is considered the trafficker. So even if it's a survival sex situation, so that's important for us to realize that even if that young person is choosing to engage in the work, the fact that they are a minor means that they aren't in a position to make that decision for themselves and that somebody else is benefiting from that exploitation. So this is a scenario to think about. I know that many of you have to log off, but the scenario, Jennifer is 12 years old and comes to the clinic with a chronic urinary tract infection. The social worker reports that Jennifer and her mother and 2 younger sisters recently moved in with a neighbor after being evicted. Jennifer's mother is answering all the questions and doesn't like to talk about the man they live with. And this scenario is to illustrate a few red flags. And some of the red flags would be that Jennifer has chronic urinary tract infections, which can be associated with sexual activity. Another red flag is that they're experiencing homelessness or poverty, and Jennifer's mother doesn't like talking about the man they live with. This could be a trafficking situation if Jennifer's mother knows about the potential violence and is choosing not to respond. If the man that they're living with is sexually abusing Jennifer or her siblings or even the mother, then that could be a trafficking situation. So it's important for us to know how you would respond to a situation like that, who would be in contact with Child Protective Services, what kind of resources would be available, if a sexual assault forensic exam is going to be ordered, what law enforcement is going to be involved, what kind of long-term resources, what kind of immediate crisis resources. So this scenario is just an opportunity for us to kind of think about all the different variables in a trafficking situation and how a situation that somebody wouldn't necessarily think of as trafficking could be, just depending on what those dynamics are. So some local resources I've listed there, including the number for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, as well as resources if you wanted more information about the statistics and where they came from. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a great resource, as well as Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, which is located in New York, but they have a lot of really great resources. So those are some links that you can click on to follow more specific information about statistics and different forms of trafficking, as well as the Trafficking in Persons and Worker Exploitation Task Force hotline numbers. And there is my contact information. I know that was a lot of information in a short period of time. A lot of my trainings are longer and more in depth, and we also work to adapt our trainings to the specific needs of the audience, whether that is predominantly advocate-based or whether that's more community or law enforcement-based. So just know that this training is not meant to be all-encompassing, but really just to kind of introduce you to the dynamics of human trafficking and get you started. Know that we do have trainings available that are more in depth and go into more dynamics, and also more focused on community and law enforcement response and assessing whether human trafficking recovery protocols are trauma-informed and victim-centered. So just know that you can always reach out to TAASA as a resource, or out to me specifically if you have questions regarding human trafficking or other forms of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual assault, and know that we appreciate the work that you all do and appreciate your interest in the topic, and know that you can contact us for more information. So thank you so much. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation with your questions or comments, and know that there will be a certificate of attendance that can be made available to you after you complete the evaluation. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Laramie, for all this wonderful information. And that does it for this session. And we are done for today. Thank you all.